For centuries, a single image has dominated the world's imagination, in which they have lied to you. And don't start crying about it now. Thousands of slaves, dragging stones across the desert, whipped under a merciless sun to raise the pyramids of Egypt. It's the picture painted in old Hollywood epics, textbooks, and even Sunday sermons. It's a story that stuck, not because it was true, but because it was convenient. It made ancient Africa look like a place of cruelty and servitude, instead of brilliance and organization. But what if that entire story, the slave-built pyramids, was a misunderstanding born from bias, mistranslation, and myth? What if the builders of the pyramids were not enslaved laborers at all, but proud, paid citizens who saw their work as a sacred duty to their nation and their gods? The truth, buried for millennia beneath the sand, is finally resurfacing. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence that completely redefines what we know about the builders of Giza. Far from being beaten prisoners, these workers lived in organized communities, ate well, received medical care, and were buried with honor near the monuments they helped create. These weren't faceless slaves. They were skilled craftsmen, engineers, and farmers who helped build one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever known. And that civilization, make no mistake, was African. Not in the abstract sense, not by proximity. Egypt sits on the African continent, its people's skin bronzed by the same sun that darkened the Nubians to the south. Ancient art, mummified remains, and linguistic patterns all confirm what modern scholarship sometimes hesitates to say out loud. Egypt was built by African hands, African minds, and African hearts. So how did we lose that truth? How did a people once hailed as divine architects become reduced to the myth of enslaved labor? To answer that, we have to go back, not to the time of the pharaohs, but to the time of the storytellers. Because history isn't just written by the victors, it's rewritten by those who fear what the truth might reveal. When the Greek historian Herodotus visited Egypt around 450 BCE, he recorded stories told by local priests and guides. But Herodotus was an outsider. His words were filtered through translators, cultural gaps, and his own biases. He spoke of workers and laborers, but centuries later, European scholars, viewing the world through the lens of their own slave economies, interpreted those terms to mean slaves. Over time, the nuance disappeared. The idea that Africans could have organized themselves to achieve such monumental feats was quietly replaced with the assumption that they must have done it through forced labor. It was an interpretation shaped not by evidence, but by prejudice. Then came the religious retellings. In popular Western tradition, biblical narratives were woven into Egyptian history, and suddenly, the Hebrews were imagined as the pyramid builders. Movies and pulp novels carried that image across the world. Lines of dark-skinned men in chains, overseen by cruel masters, toiling endlessly in the desert. The image became so powerful that it survived long after archaeologists began to prove otherwise. In the late 20th century, excavations near the Giza Plateau revealed something astonishing: the workers' village. This wasn't a slave camp, it was a well-planned settlement, complete with bakeries, breweries, storage rooms, and sleeping quarters. Animal bones showed that the workers ate prime cuts of beef and fish, not scraps. There were medical facilities where broken bones were set and infections treated, luxuries no slave would have been granted. The builders even left graffiti inside the pyramids, proudly identifying themselves by crew names like the Drunkards of Menkaure or the Friends of Khufu. You don't name yourself Friends of the King if you're enslaved. What we see here is a complex, state-organized workforce. These were seasonal laborers, farmers, masons, and artisans who offered their time during the Nile's flood season when their fields were underwater. Their service wasn't punishment, it was participation. They were part of something larger than themselves, something sacred. Building a pyramid was not just construction, it was cosmic. The structure represented the bridge between the earthly and the divine, and contributing to it was an act of devotion. But perhaps the most revolutionary part of this rediscovered truth is what it reveals about the nature of ancient African governance. Egypt's social order was not built on the exploitation of chained slaves, but on a system of civic duty, religious purpose, and national pride. It shows a people capable of large-scale cooperation, meticulous engineering, and economic organization, thousands of years before Europe's first cities even formed. Still, the myth of slave labor persists, partly because it fits a comfortable narrative. It's easier to imagine African greatness as something that required outside help or cruelty to achieve, rather than as a natural product of genius and discipline. And so, the lie lived on. Today, as modern archaeology peels away the layers of misconception, a different image emerges, not of slaves and overseers, but of architects and citizens, of men and women, united under a shared vision of eternity. The pyramids, in this light, are not monuments of oppression. They are symbols of identity, purpose, and African brilliance. This is not revisionism, it's restoration, and it's only the beginning. For centuries, the story of Egypt's great pyramids has been told from the top down: pharaohs, gods, and monuments. But beneath the sand, at the base of those towering stones, lies the story of the people who actually built them. And that story, for a long time, went untold. When archaeologists began excavating near the Giza Plateau in the 1990s, they expected to find little more than quarries or temporary slave encampments. What they discovered, instead, shattered everything the world thought it knew about pyramid construction. Under layers of sand and centuries of wind lay an entire village, not a prison, not a camp, but a city of workers. Streets, bakeries, breweries, workshops, even a small cemetery. It was clear that whoever these people were, they weren't slaves being discarded at the edge of the empire. They were valued citizens, respected enough to be buried beside the world's most sacred monuments. Archaeologists called it Hayt el-Ghurab, the lost city of the pyramid builders. It sat just a few hundred meters from the pyramids of Khufu and Khafre, perfectly positioned to supply the workforce with everything they needed. Excavations revealed long rectangular dormitories, large enough to house crews of about 40 men each. There were food storage rooms, stocked with evidence of bread and beer, staples of the Egyptian diet. Thousands of animal bones were uncovered: cattle, sheep, and fish, showing that these workers ate well, even luxuriously, compared to the average citizen. The diet alone told a story. Meat was expensive, reserved mostly for temple priests and nobles. If pyramid builders were being fed prime cuts, it meant the state saw their labor as sacred. They were not expendable, they were essential. And then came the cemeteries. Within walking distance of the workers' village were carefully built tombs, simple but dignified, filled with pottery, tools, and amulets. These were the final resting places of the very people who built the pyramids. They weren't tossed into mass graves like slaves. They were honored, buried in their own chambers, facing the pyramids they helped construct. Archaeologist Mark Lehner, one of the world's leading experts on Giza, said it best: if they were slaves, they wouldn't have been buried so close to the king. These findings challenge centuries of assumptions. For too long, historians had relied on the biases of ancient Greek writers or the moral imagery of later Western religion. But the sand doesn't lie. The evidence on the ground spoke of a highly organized society that mobilized its people through shared purpose, not chains. It's easy to see why this idea was resisted for so long. The notion that ancient Africans could have planned, engineered, and built something as monumental as the pyramids, using coordination and national pride alone, without outside help, without enslavement, runs counter to the way Africa has often been portrayed in the Western historical narrative. The pyramids, it was said, must have been built by slaves, or aliens, or some vanished race, unrelated to the Africans who live there now. Anything but Africans themselves. But evidence continues to mount. In Hayt el-Ghurab, researchers found administrative records, written in hieroglyphs, tally sheets, ration lists, and distribution logs. These were not the markings of forced labor overseers, but of state officials, tracking wages, food rations, and workforce rotations. The builders were divided into teams, each with its own name, often boasting a sense of pride or humor. One team famously called themselves the Drunkards of Menkori, another, the Friends of Khufu. These were ordinary Egyptians who saw their work as both duty and honor. Even their tools tell a story. Copper chisels, granite pounders, and leveling instruments show remarkable craftsmanship and organization. Each work crew had skilled masons, engineers, cooks, and physicians. Yes, physicians. Evidence of healed fractures, surgical cuts, and bone resets prove that injured workers received care. Their bodies show signs of physical strain. Yes, but also recovery, meaning they weren't abandoned when hurt. They were valued enough to be healed and sent back to work once ready. All of this points to one thing: the pyramid builders were free citizens, part of a state-run labor force that operated with structure, respect, and national purpose. They were farmers during one season and builders during another, rotating through civic duty the way some nations today rotate military service. Their work was compensated, not in coins, but in food, housing, and social honor. In Egyptian society, to build for the pharaoh was to build for eternity. So why did the slave myth stick for so long? Part of it is visual. Early Western explorers saw massive stones and immediately imagined forced labor. Part of it is cultural. 18th and 19th century Europeans couldn't conceive of large-scale African organization without slavery at its foundation. And part of it is political. The myth made it easier to justify colonization. If Africa's greatest monuments were born from servitude, then European domination could be painted as a continuation of that natural order. But archaeology is rewriting that narrative in real time. From the bones to the blueprints, everything points to a civilization not of oppression, but of structure and pride. Egypt wasn't a land built by slaves. It was a land built by citizens who believed their labor could make them eternal. The pyramids still stand today, not as tombs of kings, but as the living testimony of a society that valued purpose over power, unity over chains. The more we learn about the workers who built them, the clearer it becomes. This was not just construction, it was civilization in motion, and it was African brilliance at work. Let's strip away the mystery for a second and look at how the pyramids were actually built, not as miracles of myth, but as masterpieces of engineering, planning, and human collaboration. Because once you understand the process, the genius of ancient African civilization shines even brighter. First, it begins with logistics. The Great Pyramid of Khufu alone contains more than 2.3 million limestone blocks, each weighing between 2 and 15 tons. To modern minds, that sounds impossible without cranes, pulleys, or alien intervention. But the Egyptians had something far greater: mathematics, patience, and mastery over the land itself. They didn't drag those blocks across endless desert. They used the Nile. Each year, the river flooded, turning the land into a natural transport route. Barges carried stones from quarries miles away to Giza's construction site. Recent discoveries even uncovered a papyrus diary from a man named Mirror, one of the overseers of Khufu's pyramid project. His records, found at Wadi al-Jarf on the Red Sea, describe in vivid detail how workers ferried limestone from Tura to Giza using boats and canals. It's the oldest surviving first-hand account of pyramid construction, and it confirms what African ingenuity could achieve without chains or supernatural help. Once the stones arrived, the real art began. Teams of builders, organized into rotating groups, hauled the blocks up, gradually sloping ramps made of mud brick and limestone chippings. These ramps weren't crude. They were feats of geometry. Engineers designed them with perfect precision, aligning each layer of stone to the cardinal directions. As the pyramid rose, ramps were adjusted and extended, turning the entire structure into a living machine powered by human synchronization. And here's the part most people overlook. These weren't random workers swinging hammers. They were specialists. There were masons, water carriers, rope makers, engineers, and architects. Each crew had a clear hierarchy and task. Stonecutters shaped the blocks, haulers transported them, and fitters ensured every joint met the next with mathematical perfection, so perfect that even modern lasers have trouble finding gaps between some stones. Now think about that level of precision, done with nothing but copper tools and human will. That's not forced labor, that's mastery. But what's most fascinating is how organized their labor system was. Archaeological records show that the pyramid projects were state-sponsored workforces, not slaves belonging to private owners. Egypt's central government at the time operated like a massive public works program. When the Nile flooded and farmlands couldn't be cultivated, farmers were called into service. They weren't punished. They were employed. They were fed, housed, and even celebrated. In return, they helped build monuments that would bring spiritual balance to the nation. To the Egyptians, building a pyramid wasn't just construction, it was devotion. They believed each stone laid was a step toward eternity, that helping the pharaoh ascend to the afterlife would bless the land itself. This was more than labor. It was faith expressed through engineering. And here's the thing. The technology they used proves they understood physics and architecture on a level the world wouldn't rediscover for millennia. They mastered leverage, counterweights, and slope calculation. They even used water channels to level the foundation of each pyramid perfectly with the horizon, a method confirmed by modern experiments and laser measurements. When you see the Great Pyramid today, its sides still line up with true north within 1/15 of a degree. That's accuracy no medieval cathedral could match. It's not luck, it's science, African science. But if we accept that, it means we have to rewrite what we were taught about who was capable of greatness. Because for centuries, Western education implied that Africans couldn't organize large-scale civilizations, couldn't calculate with precision, couldn't build on such a cosmic scale. And yet here it is, the proof, carved into limestone. This wasn't a miracle. It was mathematics, labor, and unity. Thousands of skilled African workers coordinated across years, motivated not by fear, but by shared belief and social purpose. They knew their work would outlive them, and it has, for over 4,000 years. Every measurement, every alignment, every lifted stone told the same truth. This was not the work of slaves. This was the expression of a civilization confident in its genius, and that confidence extended far beyond the stones. The organization required for pyramid building shaped Egypt's entire society, from its economy to its education to its politics. It forced them to develop record-keeping, food distribution systems, and social hierarchies that turned a river valley into an empire. What the pyramids truly represent is not the power of a single pharaoh, but the collaboration of thousands of free Africans working toward a shared vision. It's the first recorded example of national teamwork on a global scale. So when people ask, how could they have built something so perfect without slaves? The answer is simple. They didn't need slaves when they had purpose. The ancient Egyptians didn't just move stone, they moved the idea of civilization forward. And every time we look up at those golden peaks, we're not just looking at monuments to kings, we're looking at monuments to African brilliance. The question now is, how did we lose that story? How did the world go from celebrating Egypt as a beacon of knowledge to claiming its people were anything but African? Because that's where the real rewriting of history begins. When Africa's genius was no longer convenient for the narrative, the rewriting of greatness. The story didn't change overnight. It was rewritten slowly, deliberately, by the hands of those who wanted to control not just the present, but the memory of the past. When Europe rediscovered Egypt in the 18th and 19th centuries, it wasn't an act of admiration. It was conquest, disguised as curiosity. Napoleon's armies didn't just march into Egypt with cannons. They brought scholars, artists, and surveyors. Their mission wasn't just to study Egypt, but to claim it intellectually, to rebrand it as something ancient yet disconnected from Africa. They called it the cradle of Western civilization, even though Egypt sits firmly in Africa's heart. They painted the statues lighter, drew the skin tones beige, and wrote that Egypt's greatness was somehow foreign to the continent it stood on. And just like that, African genius was stolen again, this time with ink instead of chains. When early European scholars saw the pyramids, they couldn't believe that black Africans could have built them. Their own racial theories wouldn't allow it. To them, intelligence, architecture, and mathematics were European traits. So if Egypt was brilliant, then Egypt couldn't have been African. They called the builders Semitic, Mediterranean, or Caucasian, anything but African. And this rewriting wasn't accidental, it was systemic. Textbooks, museum exhibits, and academic journals all repeated the same distortion until it became fact, even when evidence screamed otherwise. The hieroglyphs, the art, the mummies themselves, they filtered everything through the same lens, whiten the story, shrink the truth, and erase the roots. The lie spread far beyond classrooms. Hollywood joined in too. In the early films, Egyptian kings were played by white actors with blue eyes. The extras, when they needed servants, laborers, or background faces, were darker skinned, faceless, voiceless. That visual coding did something powerful. It told the world who to see as the builders of civilization, and who to see as the background to it. The myth of slaves building the pyramids fed perfectly into this framework. It allowed Western historians to maintain two illusions at once: that Egypt's brilliance wasn't black, and that massive African achievement must still depend on oppression. It's why the idea of slave-built pyramids lingered for centuries. It fit neatly into both racism and religion. Western interpretations of the Bible spoke of Israelites enslaved in Egypt, though there's no archaeological record that ties those events to the building of the pyramids. But the story was too convenient to let go. It made Egypt the villain and Europe the redeemer. It made Africa the stage for someone else's suffering instead of someone's sovereignty. But the earth has a way of rejecting lies. Every shovel of sand unearthed the truth. African names on builders' tombs, African faces in relief carvings, African burial traditions beneath the stones. The more that was found, the clearer it became that Egypt wasn't a borrowed civilization. It was an African empire, built by African people, for African gods, on African soil. Yet even as the evidence piled up, the resistance to the truth remained fierce. Museums still displayed light-skinned pharaohs. Textbooks still described Egypt as Middle Eastern. The goal wasn't just to claim history, it was to disconnect black people from their own legacy of mastery. Because when you convince a people that their ancestors were slaves, not architects, you control how they see themselves forever. The power in rewriting history is that it shapes identity, and for centuries, the world has been walking around with a distorted reflection of Africa's truth. But that reflection is cracking. The rise of African scholars, the rediscovery of primary sources, and the courage to speak the unfiltered truth are restoring what was lost. The builders of the pyramids weren't slaves, and they weren't outsiders. They were the children of the Nile, descendants of Kushite kings and Nubian queens, Africans who understood that to build in stone was to defy time itself. The lie lasted for centuries, but the stones never lied. And now, piece by piece, the truth is rising again from the sand. The only question left is, when the evidence is right in front of us, why do so many still cling to the myth? The power behind the myth. The answer to that question cuts deeper than most historians care to admit. Because the myth of slave-built pyramids didn't survive this long by accident. It was preserved because it served a purpose. a political one, a psychological one, and a cultural one. You see, history is not just about facts, it's about control. Whoever controls the story controls the people who come after it. When colonial Europe began carving up Africa, they needed a justification that made the conquest sound noble instead of criminal. So they told a story that Africa had no civilization, no innovation, no history worth remembering. Egypt was the exception they couldn't ignore. So instead of admitting its African roots, they repackaged it as Mediterranean. In that one move, they separated Africa from its greatest symbol of power, and they did it so completely that even some Africans today struggle to claim it as their own. That's the power of narrative warfare. It's not about erasing the monument itself. You can't erase a pyramid. It's about erasing the meaning behind it. The myth worked because it reinforced a worldview that put Europe at the center of progress and Africa at the margins. If the greatest African civilization could be reframed as non-African, then colonial rule could be sold as bringing civilization to a place that supposedly never had it. That's how propaganda becomes history. And for generations, this was the version taught in schools across the world. Even when African historians pushed back, even when evidence of indigenous mathematics, astronomy, and architecture appeared in plain sight, the institutions in power refused to update the story. Why? Because admitting the truth would force the world to rewrite its foundation. It wasn't just political, it was psychological. The image of African people as enslaved laborers fit neatly into the racial hierarchies that justified slavery in the Americas. If Egypt's monuments were born from forced labor, then the entire narrative of black oppression could be framed as a historical constant. That's just how the world works, they'd say. But what happens when you flip that story? When you reveal that the pyramids were built by organized, educated, and free Africans, people who engineered stone with cosmic precision and mathematical grace, suddenly, the whole hierarchy collapses. Suddenly, those once called primitive become the descendants of the world's first civil engineers. That's the kind of truth that terrifies empires, because it means their dominance isn't destiny, it's deception. And deception only works when the truth stays buried. So they buried it. They ignored the African color in tomb paintings, where builders were shown with rich brown and dark gold skin. They mistranslated words like Kem and Kemet, which literally mean the black land, not just for its soil but for its people. They turned African deities into mythic symbols while stripping their cultural context away. Even the word pharaoh, which originally came from Pura, meaning great house, was transformed into a caricature, a tyrant ruling over slaves, instead of a ruler representing divine balance. But archaeology, once freed from colonial bias, tells another story. The workers' graffiti on pyramid stones, the burial amulets inscribed with local names, the granaries built to feed thousands, these are the marks of a people building for themselves, not of a people being forced. They weren't constructing monuments to their oppression. They were constructing testaments to their unity. Every brick was a declaration: we exist, we endure, we build forever. And still, even today, you can feel the tension between the myth and the evidence. Walk into a museum in London or Paris, and you'll see the artifacts of African brilliance behind glass, labeled in languages foreign to the people who made them. The captions speak of ancient mystery or unknown origins, as if the truth isn't written in the faces carved into the stone. Broad noses, full lips, hair that curls and coils in the African sun. The features are right there, undeniable, and yet the label will whisper Eastern Mediterranean. It's not ignorance. It's intentional misdirection. Because if the world accepts that Africans were the first great engineers, then it has to accept that everything it thought it invented might not have started in Europe after all. So the myth persists because it's comfortable. For some, it allows the powerful to stay powerful, and it keeps descendants of Africa disconnected from the proof of their own greatness. But myths can only live in the dark. The moment the light hits them, they begin to crumble. And the light is spreading, through new research, through young historians, through voices refusing to stay quiet. The truth about who built the pyramids isn't just about Egypt. It's about reclaiming the origin of civilization itself. It's about returning the crown to the rightful continent. And when that truth becomes impossible to deny, the entire foundation of the Western narrative begins to shake. Because if Africa built the first wonder of the world, what else did it build that we've been taught to forget? The workforce of the sun. Picture the Giza Plateau at its height, not as a scene of chained men under the whip, but as a thriving city buzzing with life and purpose. Thousands of men and women, artisans, stonecutters, bakers, brewers, surveyors, and priests, all united under one vision. They were not slaves driven by cruelty, but citizens motivated by faith, community, and honor. They called themselves the servants of the God King, a title not of subjugation, but of devotion. To them, constructing the pyramid wasn't punishment. It was participation in a divine act. Every stone lifted was a prayer. Every alignment measured was a connection between heaven and earth. Archaeologists have uncovered worker villages just south of the Giza pyramids, entire neighborhoods, complete with streets, workshops, cemeteries, and kitchens that tell a story of organized, respected labor. The people there ate well: beef, fish, bread, and beer, far from the meager rations you'd expect of enslaved workers. They received medical care, lived with their families, and were buried with honor near the very monuments they helped raise. That's not how empires treat slaves. That's how nations honor citizens. And this system wasn't chaos, it was precision. Every detail, from how the limestone blocks were quarried to how they were dragged and fitted, followed mathematical logic and social coordination that still baffles modern engineers. Teams of 20 men worked in rotations, hauling stones using wooden sleds, lubricated with water to reduce friction. Overseers managed the logistics, while architects and priests handled the sacred geometry, ensuring the pyramid's sides aligned almost perfectly with true north, something even 21st century builders struggled to replicate. This wasn't forced labor. This was a national project, a collaboration between intellect and muscle, spirit and science. Imagine standing at the base of Khufu's pyramid as a laborer in 2500 BCE. You're not thinking about chains or punishment. You're thinking about the generations who will walk beneath this monument long after you're gone. You know your contribution is eternal. The songs of the workers ring across the desert, praises to Ra, to Osiris, to the Pharaoh who stands as the bridge between mortal and divine. The pyramid becomes more than stone, it becomes memory. And when your shift ends, you return to a village alive with laughter and food, to friends who share your pride. Archaeologists have found graffiti scrawled across the construction blocks, teams naming themselves things like the Drunkards of Menkaure and the Friends of Khufu. Those aren't the marks of despair, they're the signatures of camaraderie and ownership. The builders saw themselves not as victims, but as craftsmen of destiny. But here's where the evidence cuts through centuries of distortion. Their bodies tell the truth. Excavations of worker cemeteries reveal well-fed individuals with signs of healed injuries, meaning they received treatment and rest. Slaves, on the other hand, are disposable in every historical system that used them. They were worked to death, not healed back to strength. The bones of these builders tell a different story, of people valued enough to be cared for. Their graves were lined with goods, their names remembered in inscriptions. They were not faceless labor, they were Egypt's backbone, ordinary citizens immortalized through work that touched eternity. So how did such an advanced cooperative labor force emerge in the ancient world? The answer lies in how Egypt viewed duty. The land of Kemet didn't separate religion from daily life. The pharaoh was more than a ruler. He was the embodiment of cosmic order. Ma, to build for him was to build for balance itself. Each worker was participating in a ritual act of sustaining the universe. In that worldview, labor wasn't about servitude, it was sacred service. Every citizen had a role, from quarry master to cook, and each saw that role as vital to the harmony of all things. That's why the pyramids endure, not just because of stone and skill, but because of shared purpose. The truth of Egypt's greatness doesn't rest on mystery. It rests on organization, unity, and belief. The three pillars of African civilization, the same principles that shaped Timbuktu, Great Zimbabwe, and Benin, would echo here, a collective sense that greatness was built together, not imposed by force. That's what modern historians are finally rediscovering, that the builders of the pyramids weren't slaves at all, but citizens of one of the most sophisticated states humanity has ever seen. And those citizens were African, not metaphorically, but literally. The bones, the art, the genetics all confirm it. They were the children of the Nile, dark-skinned sons and daughters of the sun, who took the dust of their land and turned it into immortality. So when you look up at those pyramids, shimmering against the horizon, remember this: they were not monuments of pain, but monuments of pride. They stand because a free people built them together, a people who believed their work would echo through time, and it has. The heartbeat of those builders still hums beneath the stones, whispering a truth the world is finally ready to hear. The pyramids were not the triumph of slavery, they were the triumph of civilization. The African hands that carved eternity. Let's strip away the last of the myths and stare straight at the evidence that's been sitting in front of us all along. The laborers who built Egypt's pyramids were African, not as a poetic claim, but as a genetic, cultural, and archaeological fact. Their skeletal remains, their artwork, and the very language they spoke all trace back to the heart of Africa. DNA analysis of mummified remains from the Old Kingdom, as well as the later dynasties, shows strong genetic ties to populations from the Nile Valley, Nubia, and regions deeper into sub-Saharan Africa. These were not outsiders imported from elsewhere. They were native to this soil, sons and daughters of the same river that gave birth to their civilization. The faces painted on tomb walls aren't European or Middle Eastern. They're distinctly African: deep brown tones, tightly coiled hair, broad features, the same visual heritage seen from Sudan to Senegal. Yet for centuries, historians twisted that reality, repainting the faces lighter, calling them Mediterranean or Semitic, to distance Egypt from its African identity. But the truth has a way of resurfacing, even when buried under centuries of bias. Walk through the tombs of the workers at Deir el-Medina, or the burial grounds near Giza, and you see humanity, not servitude. You see men and women buried with tools, ornaments, and hieroglyphic prayers. These were skilled artisans, organized in rotating crews, each proud of their craftsmanship. Their artistry wasn't born from coercion. It was passed down through family lines, honed by years of apprenticeship. A father taught his son the weight of limestone, the geometry of a perfect cut, the sacred balance that kept the pyramid sides true. Their trade was identity, and their legacy was permanence. If slavery had been the foundation of Egypt's power, there would be records. Egypt documented everything, from grain rations to the movement of cattle. Scribes left meticulous accounts of daily life. Yet in all the vast archives of papyrus, tomb inscriptions, and temple walls, there's no mention of mass slave labor for pyramid construction. Instead, we find references to workers, teams, crews, and servants of the god king, titles of pride and purpose. There were indeed slaves in Egypt, mostly prisoners of war, but they were not the ones building the Great Pyramids. The men who built those structures were citizens, compensated with food, housing, and respect. They weren't shackled, they were mobilized. The rediscovery of the workers' village in the 1990s obliterated the old slave narrative once and for all. Archaeologists found the remains of bread ovens, breweries, cattle bones, a diet richer than what most peasants in medieval Europe would ever know. They unearthed limestone graffiti that recorded team rivalries and jokes, inscriptions calling the workforce beloved of Khufu. In one tomb, they even found hieroglyphs praising the unity of the builders. We live for the king, and he lives through us. That's not a message of oppression. That's a declaration of collective purpose. The workers believed in their pharaoh because he represented divine order, and by building his eternal house, they secured their own passage into immortality. And this sense of pride, this collective consciousness, didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was the product of African social philosophy: community above individual, unity above ego. The same values that shaped villages across the continent for millennia, where every person had a role, and every role had dignity, were at the heart of Egypt's labor system. The builders were bound, not by chains, but by culture, by a worldview that saw service to the divine as a shared duty. This is why the pyramids have endured, because they weren't built through fear, but through faith. Yet the Western narrative had to erase this truth. The image of Africans as the architects of civilization clashed too hard with colonial ideology. To admit that black Africans engineered the most precise and enduring monuments in history would have shattered centuries of racial hierarchy. So they rewrote it. They cast Egyptians as Near Eastern, reclassified Nubians as foreigners, and painted out the African genius that birthed the pyramids. But archaeology doesn't lie. Neither do bones, DNA, or the faces carved into the stone. Every block of limestone at Giza is a testament to the hands that shaped it. African hands. Every line of hieroglyphs is a voice echoing from that truth. The builders' villages, their tools, their food, their homes, all of it forms a portrait of an African workforce that was free, organized, and spiritually driven. They were builders of faith, architects of balance, citizens of a kingdom that saw no division between labor and the divine. They stood on their own soil, under their own sun, and left behind something the world still marvels at 5,000 years later. That is the legacy of the real builders of the pyramids. Not slaves suffering under the lash, but free Africans building eternity with their own hands, hearts, and hope. The myth of slave-built Egypt and the power of narrative. For generations, the Western world clung to a comforting myth that the Great Pyramids, symbols of divine order and architectural perfection, were built on the backs of slaves. It's a narrative that served a purpose. It made Egypt seem brutal, oppressive, and somehow more primitive than the supposedly enlightened civilizations of Greece and Rome. It let colonial historians maintain a hierarchy of civilization, one where Africa could never be the cradle of genius, only of labor. And yet, every piece of evidence we've uncovered pulls that story apart. There is not a single ancient Egyptian record that supports the idea of mass slave labor in pyramid construction. No carvings of whips, no chains, no records of slave markets feeding Giza. Instead, what we find is organization, meticulous, sophisticated, humane. The pyramids were built through logistics and loyalty, not fear. The truth is that the idea of slave-built pyramids didn't come from ancient history. It came from much later storytellers. Early European travelers, missionaries, and even Hollywood helped spread the image of shackled men dragging stones across the desert, while cruel overseers shouted from the shadows. It made good drama, but it was bad history. It played into biblical imagery, echoing the Exodus story, the Israelites enslaved in Egypt. And from there, the myth stuck. Western textbooks absorbed it, teachers repeated it, generations grew up, imagining Egypt as a land of suffering, not achievement. But if you dig into the Egyptian texts themselves, the pyramid texts, the tomb inscriptions, the workers' graffiti, you find a completely different story. You find respect, structure, and pride. The pyramid builders were part of a rotating labor system called the corvée, where citizens contributed to state projects as a civic and spiritual duty. These weren't unpaid slaves. They were compensated in food, clothing, and housing, and many returned, season after season, generation after generation. To the Egyptians, this was service to Maat, the cosmic order that governed balance and harmony. Building the pyramid wasn't just construction, it was worship. It was aligning stone and spirit in perfect geometry. That sense of purpose is why, even now, their monuments still defy time itself. It's also important to remember what these builders were constructing. The pyramids weren't tombs in the way we think of graves. They were engines of transformation, designed to help the pharaoh become one with the divine. Every worker, every artisan, believed that by helping the king ascend, they were ensuring cosmic stability in their own place in eternity. That's why they left graffiti like the drunkards of Menkaure or the friends of Khufu, teams with pride, humor, and identity. Does that sound like the voice of slaves, or of skilled citizens who loved their work enough to immortalize it in stone? Still, Western historians resisted the obvious truth. To accept that Africans organized, engineered, and built something so advanced, without outside influence, meant admitting that Africa didn't just contribute to civilization, it defined it. So they twisted the narrative. They said the builders must have been Asiatics, that the genius came from somewhere else. But the climate, the materials, the design principles, all are African. The word pharaoh itself comes from Pura, great house, an African concept of divine rulership tied to the land and its cycles. The Nile wasn't a border between civilizations, it was a bridge between cultures of the same root. What we're seeing, slowly, is a correction of history, a global recognition that the genius of Egypt was black genius. The laborers, architects, and mathematicians who aligned those stones with celestial precision were Africans, rooted in the same soil as the people of Nubia, Kush, and the Sudanese kingdoms. Their achievements didn't emerge in isolation, they were part of a long continuum of African science and spirituality. The same mathematical understanding that guided the builders of Giza can be traced to the people who later raised great stone circles in Nabta Playa, to the astronomers of ancient Nubia who tracked the stars and mapped the floods of the Nile. So when people still repeat the myth that slaves built the pyramids, what they're really doing is echoing an old colonial script, one that needed Africa to be a land of labor, not leadership. They don't realize that they're erasing the humanity, intellect, and artistry of the very people who built the foundation of civilization itself. The irony is that Egypt's own records never denied who its builders were. We did. And now that the evidence is undeniable, we have to ask ourselves why it was easier to believe in whips and chains than in African genius. The pyramids were not the result of suffering, they were the result of cooperation, planning, and national pride. They stand not as monuments to slavery, but to the unity of a civilization that saw creation as sacred. And perhaps that's the real reason their story was rewritten, because a people who could build eternity without oppression were too powerful to fit inside someone else's version of history. The builders themselves. Faces, lives, and legacy. Picture this, a bustling village just south of the Great Pyramid of Giza, filled with laughter, shouting, and the rhythmic sound of hammers on limestone. This wasn't a prison camp. It was a community. Excavations at the workers' village have revealed homes built with care, kitchens with bread ovens, fish bones from the Nile, cattle bones from state rations. Archaeologists even found the remains of beef, expensive meat, the kind only free citizens or honored workers would receive. These were not slaves surviving on scraps. These were laborers fed by the state, respected for their contribution, and buried with dignity near the monuments they built. Think about that. Slaves were never buried beside kings, but these men and women were. Their tombs held offerings, hieroglyphs of pride, even personal items, proof that their lives mattered. That's not oppression. That's honor. They were masons, Engineers, farmers, bakers, and artisans who took shifts between farming seasons to build for eternity. They left behind hieroglyphs, naming themselves the drunkards of Menkor, the friends of Khufu, and the followers of the White Crown. These names tell us everything we need to know: camaraderie, humor, identity, and national pride. The pyramid was not a punishment. It was a project of purpose, a chance to serve the gods, serve the land, and leave a mark that would never fade. Every block they lifted carried more than stone. It carried belief, and yet, for centuries, the faces of these builders have been distorted. Textbooks show pale figures, Mediterranean features, as if to scrub the truth from the stone. But the skeletons, the DNA, the art, they all tell a different story. The workers' remains reveal broad nasal bridges, dark pigmentation genes, and cranial features consistent with Northeast African populations, unmistakably African. Their art reflects the same truth. The people painted on tomb walls were not foreigners. They were sons and daughters of the Nile, with deep brown skin, coiled hair, and pride in their posture. This was the face of Egypt, African, dignified, complex. Even Greek historians, like Herodotus, described Egyptians as melancros, meaning dark-skinned and woolly-haired. The evidence was always there. We just stopped listening when it no longer fit the colonial fantasy. Every tool, every brick, every plan bears the mark of ingenuity, not servitude. The builders lived in organized teams under foremen, managed by scribes who tracked labor schedules, supplies, and logistics with astonishing precision. Their records show rotating labor forces, each serving for a few months, ensuring no single community was overburdened. It was a national project, Egypt building itself, not one group enslaving another. Imagine the pride of walking past that monument when your season was done, knowing you had placed a block in eternity. That pride was generational. Fathers worked beside sons. Families returned year after year, not because they were forced to, but because they believed in something larger than life itself. But we have to ask, why was that image replaced with chains? Because showing Africans as free, intelligent, organized workers dismantles centuries of racist ideology. The idea that the pyramids were built by slaves fed directly into Western justification for slavery itself. If even Egypt, the symbol of grandeur, relied on slave labor, then maybe, they argued, slavery was just part of civilization. That lie became the moral shield of colonizers, but archaeology shattered it. The remains of healed bones show workers received medical care. Their diets were rich. Their burial sites were adorned. None of that fits the picture of slavery. It fits a proud labor force, a people unified under purpose. And that's where the heart of this story lives, in the everyday humanity of the builders, the laughter echoing through the workers' village, the shared bread and beer after long days under the sun, the songs of rhythm that kept the labor synchronized. They weren't just stacking stone, they were harmonizing with the universe. The pyramids were built by people who believed they were part of a divine equation, that the act of creation itself was sacred. That belief still pulses through the ruins of Giza, through every cracked limestone face and every sand-covered inscription. These builders weren't slaves. They were citizens. They were Africans. They were the hands that shaped eternity. And the world still refuses to say their names. But the stones remember. The desert remembers. The pyramids stand not as tombs of kings, but as testaments to the power of free African labor, intellect, and unity. The kind of power that could build forever and never be broken. The architects of eternity, science, math, and sacred precision. For too long, people have looked at the pyramids and seen mystery where there was mastery. They ask how, as if Africans couldn't possibly have engineered such perfection without alien help. But the truth is simpler and far more powerful. They used mathematics, astronomy, and divine symmetry to craft a structure that still defies modern imitation. Every measurement, of the Great Pyramid corresponds with celestial and terrestrial laws, a marriage between heaven and earth, built not through magic, but through genius. The base of Khufu's pyramid is aligned almost perfectly to the four cardinal directions, north, south, east, west, with an error of less than 1/20th of a degree. That kind of precision isn't accidental. It's evidence of a civilization that understood the movement of stars, the curvature of the earth, and the balance of geometry long before Europe rediscovered those sciences. The builders didn't guess. They calculated. They didn't stumble. They designed. They were engineers in linen kilts, scientists in the desert, mathematicians under the sun. The pyramid wasn't just a tomb. It was an equation carved in stone. Its height compared to its perimeter mirrors the relationship between a circle's radius and circumference, a hidden reference to pi. The slope angles correspond with the sun's path at specific times of the year, creating light effects that align with solstices and equinoxes. These weren't coincidences. They were codes, sacred geometry that symbolized eternal order. To the Egyptians, math wasn't cold logic, it was divine rhythm. They didn't separate science from spirit, because to them, understanding creation was a way of honoring the Creator. Each block, each proportion, was a hymn to balance, a prayer written in limestone. And at the heart of that brilliance were African minds, surveyors, architects, astronomers, and planners who mapped the sky with naked eyes, and instruments carved from wood and copper. The scribe who tracked every block's placement had the same intellectual authority as the mathematician designing its angle. These weren't slaves under lash. They were scholars and craftspeople working in unison. The workers who hauled the stones followed the guidance of the stretching the cord ceremony, an ancient ritual where priests aligned the structure to the stars. Imagine that moment, men and women standing under a black sky, filled with constellations, stretching ropes, measuring shadows, whispering prayers to the heavens as they laid the foundation of eternity. That's not oppression, that's divine collaboration. And yet, when modern textbooks discuss geometry, they start with Pythagoras. When they talk astronomy, they start with Greece. When they discuss architecture, they skip straight to Rome. But Pythagoras learned in Egypt. The Greeks studied at Egyptian temples, calling them the houses of life. Plato and Herodotus both acknowledged that Egypt was the fountainhead of ancient knowledge. The irony is sharp. The very civilization that taught the world math and philosophy was written out of the equation by those it educated. Egypt wasn't borrowing from anyone. Others were borrowing from her. The Nile wasn't a student. It was the teacher. Archaeologists continue to find the tools of this brilliance: copper chisels, plumb lines, leveling instruments, blueprints etched into limestone fragments. These relics reveal the same thing ancient Egyptians always knew, that intellect, faith, and skill were the three pillars of creation. The men and women who built these pyramids weren't laborers in despair. They were visionaries with purpose. They lived by Mayat, the principle of harmony, justice, and truth, and every stone they set was a reflection of that order. That's why the pyramids endure, not because they were built by slaves, but because they were built by believers, people who saw themselves as extensions of the divine. When you stand before the Great Pyramid today, you're not looking at ruins, you're looking at proof of what African civilization achieved at its peak. Precision that rivals satellites, architecture that defies erosion, a structure so perfect that engineers still debate how it was done. But here's the truth. It wasn't done through mystery, aliens, or magic. It was done by minds that understood the world in ways we're only beginning to rediscover. The real question isn't how they built it, it's why the world still struggles to admit who built it. The African genius. They tried to erase every civilization, tells stories about its greatness. But what happens when your story is stolen and rewritten by those who feared your brilliance? That's exactly what happened to ancient Egypt. For centuries, European explorers and historians couldn't reconcile what they saw with what they believed. They stared at monuments of impossible precision, read hieroglyphs describing an advanced, literate, organized African people, and yet refused to accept what the evidence screamed, that black Africans built one of the most sophisticated civilizations in human history. So they rewrote the narrative. They said Egypt was Mediterranean, or Middle Eastern, or a mystery race. Anything but African. They used maps that sliced the continent in half at the Sinai, as if geography could erase bloodlines. But the truth is, Egypt was not an anomaly. It was the northern crown of a long chain of African civilizations, Kush, Nubia, Tasseti, connected by blood, culture, and philosophy. The same dark-skinned people who built pyramids in Sudan and carved temples in Meroe were the ancestors of those who ruled at Giza. Egypt didn't rise out of nothing. It rose out of Africa. You can still see it in the art. The skin tones painted on tomb walls range from deep brown to gold, not pale, not foreign, but distinctly African. The statues of pharaohs show full lips, broad noses, coiled hair, features mirrored in the people of modern-day Sudan and southern Egypt. The crowns, the jewelry, the body adornments, all African in design and symbolism. And when you trace the language, it fits too. The Egyptian tongue belongs to the Afro-Asiatic family, with links to languages spoken farther south. Even their spiritual system, built around ancestor veneration, natural cycles, and balance, echoes through the philosophies of sub-Saharan traditions. Egypt was Africa expressing itself at the highest possible frequency. But once Europeans laid eyes on the pyramids, they couldn't accept that. To them, Africa was supposed to be primitive, a place of darkness and dependency. So they split Egypt from its own continent to protect their worldview. They said, these people must be different. They can't be the same Africans we enslaved. And so, just like that, Africa's crown jewel was stolen. Egypt became whitewashed, its features softened, its skin lightened in paintings, its genius attributed to outsiders. Hollywood turned pharaohs into Europeans. Textbooks quietly avoided the topic. And over time, the world began to forget that Egypt's brilliance was born in Africa, not imported from abroad. This wasn't just a historical mistake. It was deliberate erasure, because to admit that Africans engineered time-defying architecture, mastered astronomy, mapped the stars, and governed with divine order would mean admitting that the roots of civilization itself are African, and that truth threatened the colonial narrative. So the lie spread through schools, through churches, through museums. Even today, some scholars hesitate to say what's obvious in the bones, the art, and the DNA, that the builders of Egypt were black Africans, proud and powerful. The same energy that carved hieroglyphs into granite still flows in the descendants scattered across the diaspora, in their rhythm, in their resilience, in their genius. The pyramids stand as monuments, not just to Egyptian greatness, but to African excellence. They are reminders that Africa was never behind. It was ahead. While Europe was emerging from caves, Africans were aligning architecture with the cosmos. While others counted time in seasons, Africans measured eternity in stone. And maybe that's why they hid the truth, because once you know where civilization really began, the entire narrative of progress collapses. Egypt wasn't an accident. It was the inevitable expression of a continent that knew itself, its spirit, and its place in the universe. So when they ask who built the pyramids, tell them it wasn't slaves, it wasn't aliens, it wasn't lost white architects, it was Africans, free, brilliant, and divine. And no amount of rewriting, repainting, or whitewashing can change that. The desert remembers, the stones remember. And now, so do we. The workforce of pride and purpose. When we look at the ruins of Giza, we tend to imagine nameless laborers, beaten into submission, sweating under a cruel sun for the glory of kings. But the evidence tells a very different story. The men and women who built the pyramids were not slaves. They were citizens, proud workers serving in a national project that gave their lives meaning. They were fed, paid, housed, and honored for their skill. Archaeological digs at Giza have uncovered entire workers' villages, planned communities with bakeries, breweries, hospitals, and sleeping quarters. The people who lived there weren't prisoners. They were professionals. Their bones show signs of healed injuries and medical treatment, proof that they were cared for. Their graves were lined neatly with offerings of bread and beer, symbols of respect. If they were slaves, their bodies would have been tossed aside like refuse. But these burials tell a story of dignity. Imagine waking before dawn to the sound of drums calling the teams to work. Thousands of men moving in perfect coordination, pulling ropes, singing rhythmic chants to keep time. Overseers watching not with whips, but with precise instruction. Engineers ensuring every block landed with mathematical perfection. These weren't chaotic mobs. They were organized crews, skilled at their craft. Evidence shows that workers labored in rotating teams, spending a few months at Giza before returning home to their farms. This was a national duty, a sacred contribution to something greater than themselves, to eternity. In return, their families were fed and cared for by the state. That's not slavery, that's community. The graffiti left behind by these workers is even more revealing. On hidden stones and chamber walls, they proudly carved the names of their crews: the drunkards of Menkar, the friends of Khufu, the vigorous gang. That's the language of pride, not oppression. They left jokes, symbols, and even cartoons of their supervisors, proof of camaraderie and spirit. These were human beings invested in their work, united by purpose, driven by belief. They weren't building a pyramid out of fear. They were building it out of faith, faith that their labor connected them to the divine, that their names would echo through eternity, along with the pharaohs. Every aspect of pyramid construction was an act of devotion. The limestone they cut reflected sunlight like gold, symbolizing the eternal life of the king. The granite cores came from Aswan, hauled across hundreds of miles, not by chains but by coordinated engineering brilliance. The ramps, pulleys, and sleds they designed proved they were innovators. They knew friction, balance, and leverage better than we give them credit for. And when one pyramid was finished, the workers didn't vanish. They moved to the next project, the next tomb, the next temple. This was their life's work, their national legacy. So why were they later called slaves? Because history is written by those who need to justify their own systems of oppression. When Europeans began colonizing Africa, they couldn't accept that free African people once organized one of the greatest construction projects in history. They needed Egypt's greatness to fit their worldview, so they rewrote it. They called it forced labor to make their own slavery seem like destiny. But the stones don't lie. Every piece of evidence, from worker housing to diet, remains to burial sites, shouts the same truth. These were citizens of a proud nation, building symbols of eternity with their own hands. The irony is that their real story is far more inspiring than the myth. Because what's more powerful, an empire built on chains, or a civilization built on unity? The builders of Egypt weren't victims of tyranny. They were architects of destiny. They didn't need whips to move mountains. They had purpose, and purpose moves more than fear ever could. When you stand before those stones today, don't see slaves. See citizens. Don't see oppression. See organization. Don't see misery. See majesty. These were Africans, building their forever, reclaiming the African legacy. Beneath the sands of Egypt hold more than artifacts. They hold a war for truth. For centuries, the narrative of who built the pyramids has been twisted, stolen, and repackaged through foreign eyes. But beneath the dunes, the real story has always been waiting to be reclaimed. And it begins with the faces carved into the stone. Those faces are unmistakably African. They are broad-nosed, full-lipped, proud, and regal. The artists who sculpted them were not creating fantasy. They were recording reality. The same features still live in the Nubian people of Aswan, in the dark-skinned tribes along the Nile, in the descendants scattered across Sudan and East Africa. The ancient Egyptians didn't deny their heritage. They celebrated it. Their art, their religion, their language, all pulsed with the rhythm of Africa. But when Europe's explorers arrived, they couldn't see Africa as the cradle of civilization. To them, Africa was a resource, not a revelation. So they stripped Egypt from its motherland and sold the world a myth. They pointed to the north, to Greece, to Rome, and said, "This is where civilization began." But Greece itself credited Egypt as its teacher. Philosophers like Pythagoras, Plato, and Solon studied under African priests in the temples of Heliopolis and Thebes. They carried Egyptian ideas about geometry, metaphysics, and moral order back to their own lands. Egypt was not the student, it was the master. And yet, when Western historians retold the story, they erased the teacher and glorified the pupil. They made the flow of knowledge run backward, as if Africa learned from Europe, not the other way around. It was historical theft disguised as scholarship. But the truth has a way of resurfacing. Archaeologists today are rediscovering what Africa never forgot, that Egypt was part of a long, interconnected lineage stretching from the heart of the continent. The kingdom of Kush, for instance, located in what is now Sudan, was not Egypt's rival, but its reflection. The Kushites ruled Egypt as the 25th dynasty, black African kings wearing the double crown of the pharaohs, governing from the same palaces, praying to the same gods. Their pyramids still stand in Meroe, smaller in size but identical in design, proving that the pyramid tradition was African through and through. In fact, there are more pyramids in Sudan than in all of Egypt, a silent stone testimony to the continuity of African genius. The further you travel south along the Nile, the clearer the pattern becomes. The symbols of kingship, the crook and flail, the ankh, the scarab, all have origins deeper in Africa. The concept of divine kingship, the reverence for ancestors, the balance between life and death. These ideas weren't invented at Giza. They were inherited, refined, and immortalized there. Egypt was Africa's northern lighthouse, shining its wisdom across the ancient world. And yet, modern narratives still try to isolate it, as if greatness could not possibly come from black hands. That's why reclaiming this truth matters. It's not just about geography, it's about identity. When you teach that Egypt was not African, you teach that civilization and blackness cannot coexist. You teach that brilliance, architecture, philosophy, and art belong elsewhere, anywhere but Africa. And that lie ripples through generations. It shapes how young black children see themselves, how history books portray Africa, how culture defines genius. Reclaiming Egypt's African identity is not revisionism, it's restoration. It's returning what was stolen to its rightful home. Because when you put Egypt back in Africa, suddenly the narrative shifts. Civilization doesn't start in Europe. It starts where humanity began. The builders of the pyramids were not slaves, not foreigners, not faceless laborers. They were Africans, proud citizens of a thriving, self-aware empire that saw itself as eternal. And maybe that's the most powerful truth of all, that the same continent, once dismissed as dark, was the first to master light, shadow, and stone. That Africa's sons and daughters didn't just survive history, they wrote it in granite and gold. The pyramids aren't just tombs, they are declarations. Declarations that Africa was first, Africa was brilliant, and Africa was free. The time has come to stop looking at Egypt through borrowed eyes and start seeing it for what it truly was, the beating heart of African civilization, still echoing through the sands. The global impact of Africa's master builders. When we talk about the pyramids, we're not just talking about ancient Egypt, we're talking about a blueprint that shaped the world. The architectural precision, the cosmic alignment, the sheer mastery of mathematics that went into those structures became the standard for civilizations to come. Egypt's builders were not isolated geniuses. They were the culmination of thousands of years of African innovation. The same geometry used to design the Great Pyramid of Giza, the golden ratio, the celestial alignments, the sacred measures, would later echo in temples of Greece, ziggurats of Mesopotamia, and cathedrals of Europe. But unlike those later empires, Egypt didn't build to dominate. It built to harmonize with the universe. Every stone, every corridor, every chamber was designed to reflect balance. Mayet, the principle of order and truth that guided African civilization long before Europe even named its gods. This wasn't accidental. The Egyptians saw architecture as an act of spirituality, not vanity. To them, building a pyramid was like writing a hymn in stone. It was the ultimate offering to the divine, a promise that life and death were connected through creation. That's what separates Egypt's laborers from the slaves of later empires. They weren't forced into service. They were participating in a cosmic act. These men and women saw themselves as part of something eternal. Their work was devotion, and the proof is in the remains. Archaeological digs around Giza have uncovered not chains and whips, but bakeries, breweries, and medical facilities built for the workers. The bones show signs of professional care, healed fractures, balanced diets. This was not a slave camp. It was a functioning city, a community of free citizens, working in unity for a purpose bigger than themselves. Now imagine how different our understanding of history would be if that truth had been taught all along. Instead of picturing nameless slaves under the lash, we would see proud African engineers, architects, and artists working with precision and purpose. We would see women overseeing production, families living near the work sites, communities thriving in the shadow of greatness. The workers' graffiti tells us even more. They gave their teams names like the Drunkards of Menkur or the Friends of Khufu. These were people with humor, camaraderie, and pride in their craft. Does that sound like the silence of slavery? No, it sounds like the laughter of free men, building something that would outlast empires, and outlast it did. When Greece fell, when Rome crumbled, when Europe plunged into the Dark Ages, those same pyramids stood tall, a reminder that Africa had already done what the world was still trying to figure out. They became a silent beacon, calling to the curious, the dreamers, and the conquerors. Even Napoleon's scholars, when they invaded Egypt, stood in awe of what they saw. But instead of giving credit where it was due, they twisted the story. They couldn't accept that black Africans had built something so mathematically perfect, so timeless, so divine. They called it a mystery, as if genius had to be European to exist. And that's where the myth of slave labor took root, not in evidence, but in ego. But now, as technology peels back the layers of time, that ego is being exposed. Satellite imaging shows quarry routes, transport ramps, and construction villages that map out a highly organized, voluntary workforce. New translations of hieroglyphic records mention rations, rewards, and feasts given to the workers, celebrations, not punishments. The truth couldn't be clearer. These people were not chained. They were cherished. They were honored for building something sacred. Egypt's rulers knew that the pyramid wasn't just a tomb. It was a statement of harmony between human skill and divine order. To be part of that was not suffering. It was glory. So when the world points to the pyramids as monuments to mystery, they miss the point. They're not mysteries. They're messages. Messages from an Africa that was strong, intelligent, organized, and free. An Africa that didn't wait for permission to dream on a cosmic scale. The same Africa whose children today are scattered across the globe, still inheriting the genius of those who built for eternity. We're not just descendants of survival. We're descendants of design. The blueprint for civilization is written in our DNA. Every time we innovate, create, or imagine, we're echoing the spirit of those builders who stood beneath the desert sun, stacking eternity, one stone at a time. That's not ancient history. That's living memory. The pyramids were never meant to be tombs for kings. They were mirrors for the soul of a people who already understood that immortality begins when truth is built to last. So here we are, standing in the shadow of the pyramids, the last giants of stone still whispering across millennia. The world still debates who built them, how, and why. But the truth is right there in the evidence, in the soil, in the bones, and in the legacy of a people who never stopped building. The real builders of the pyramids were not slaves under the lash of empire, but free African citizens guided by purpose, intellect, and spiritual conviction. These were not anonymous hands working for a tyrant. These were proud artisans shaping a nation's soul into stone. When you walk through the workers' village at Giza, you can still feel their humanity. You can see the bread ovens, the beer jars, the medical tools. You can trace the rhythm of their days. You can almost hear the laughter after a hard shift. The music carried on the night wind. This was life, not bondage. This was devotion, not despair. And yet, for centuries, the story was stolen, rewritten by those who couldn't bear the thought that Africa, that black people, could be the architects of eternity. They needed Egypt to be anything but African. So they stripped away the color, the context, the truth. They painted the builders as nameless slaves, the pharaohs as pale demigods, and the pyramids as puzzles too advanced for primitive people. But the evidence laughs in the face of those lies. DNA studies of mummies, depictions on tomb walls, and the art of neighboring Nubia all point to one fact: Egypt was African, born of the Nile, shaped by black genius. This isn't mythology. This is science. This is archaeology. This is truth they buried beneath centuries of distortion. And that's what makes the story of the real builders so important today. Because it's not just about ancient stones, it's about modern identity. Every time someone tells you Africa contributed nothing to civilization, remember that Africa built the civilization everyone else still studies. The principles of architecture, mathematics, engineering, and even astronomy that we use today trace their roots to the same soil that fed the Nile. The pyramids were not miracles, they were mastery. They represent what happens when a people believe their purpose is sacred and their work eternal. That's what built them, not slaves, but visionaries. The workers who raised those stones didn't vanish into history. Their spirit lives on, in the rhythm of African drums, in the geometry of West African textiles, in the symmetry of our art, in the order of our thought. The blueprint they left behind is still guiding us, still calling us to build again. Because the truth is, Africa's genius didn't end in the sand. It traveled through time, through generations, through the diaspora. Every innovation, every act of creation, every expression of brilliance, from black minds today, is another stone laid on that ancient foundation. So ask yourself, why would they lie? Why would they rather convince the world that aliens built the pyramids than admit that Africans did? Because truth destroys control. Truth reminds us who we are, what we're capable of, and what we've already done. And once a people remember that, no power on earth can make them forget again. The pyramids are proof of that. They've stood longer than any empire, untouched by time, unmoved by lies. So the next time you look at them, don't see mystery, see memory. Don't see slaves, see scientists. Don't see labor, see legacy. Because the real builders of the pyramids weren't buried beneath the stones. Their spirit still stands, unbroken, beneath the sun. And that spirit is yours. It always was. It always will be.